Abigail Carter, did not shed a tear when Charlotte Beaumont referred to her as the overweight kitchen widow before an audience of 200 guests. She remained behind the kitchen door, palms pressed firmly against the timber, as laughter rippled through the banquet hall like an incoming tide. There was no escape for her. Every plate on every table, every pastry, every bun, every grain of sugar dusting that four-tiered confection. Her labor, her sleepless nights, her sorrow poured into each mouthful. And not a single soul in that room was meant to learn her identity. If that struck a chord somewhere within you, remain with me, subscribe to this channel, see this narrative through to its conclusion, and mention your city in the comments. I'm curious to see how widely Abigail's tale spreads. The correspondence arrived on a Tuesday near the end of April, and Abigail nearly consigned it to the flames after scanning merely the opening sentence. She had been awake since 3 that morning. The ceiling above the rear bedroom had begun dripping once more. An unhurried, methodical drop landing in the identical tin pail she'd been emptying since February. She had spent the pre-dawn hours reclined in bed, tracking each fall, mentally recalculating for the 100th time just how insufficient her funds truly were. She perused the letter while standing at her kitchen table, still donning her work apron, a mug of tepid coffee beside her elbow. It originated from the Walker estate. Ethan Walker, the message stated, would wed on the 14th of July. The ceremony would accommodate upward of 200 attendees. The family sought a seasoned culinary professional of the greatest skill for complete meal preparation and service throughout the wedding festivities. 6 weeks of advance work starting May 1st. 2 full days of service. The offered payment was $40. Abigail set down the letter. She retrieved it once more. $40 represented the latter portion of her mortgage obligation. $40 marked the boundary between holding on to the 40 acres Daniel had bequeathed her and abandoning the sole ground she had ever been able to claim as her own. $40 was an amount she hadn't held in her possession at one time since the year before Daniel died, when livestock prices were strong and tomorrow still seemed like something that was rightly hers. She replied that same night. Just 2 brief lines. She accepted. She appeared at the Walker Ranch on the first Monday of May, her cutlery bundled in fabric, her mother's cast iron pan cushioned in straw, and a mental catalog of every dish she planned to prepare already firmly entrenched from appetizer to finale. She hadn't rested. She'd spent the previous evening at her kitchen table reviewing quantities, timing, and procurement until the figures settled into clear, orderly alignment in her thoughts. That was Abigail Carter's method of confronting dread. She converted it into a puzzle she could resolve. The ranch kitchen was more expansive than her entire dwelling. Twin wood, fired stoves, a broad stone hearth, an underground cold room beneath the flooring that emitted the aroma of rich soil and aged brine. It was a serious kitchen, designed by someone who recognized that nourishing people constituted meaningful labor. Standing alone within it that initial morning, Abigail sensed something loosen in her chest, a tension that had been cinched tight for an exceptionally long time. She felt like herself again. She remained there, simply inhaling the space, when the far door swung open. Charlotte Beaumont was precisely what everyone in Red Willow claimed. She was tall, fair-skinned, dressed in traveling attire that never originated from any Wyoming shop. She navigated a room as certain women do, as though the environment subtly rearranged itself to accommodate her. She regarded Abigail with cool, evaluative eyes and remained silent for a beat extended just enough to make its meaning clear. "You're the cook," she said at last. "Yes, ma'am." Abigail Carter. "I received your family's correspondence and I'm aware of who you are." Charlotte traced along the edge of the workspace, one gloved finger skimming the surface without ever making contact. "I've been informed you're satisfactory. I'll strive to exceed mere satisfaction. Ma'am." H. Clear's throat, she halted. She pivoted. "I have one stipulation. My mother referenced it in the letter, but I prefer delivering such messages in person." Her gaze swept briefly, intentionally, down Abigail's frame, then back up. "You are not to be observed. Not by guests, not during service, not at any moment of the celebration. You will stay confined to this kitchen. You will not step into any area where visitors are gathered. You will not address anyone in the main house unless spoken to directly." She paused. "You will not draw any attention to your position through visibility." The silence between them stretched for 3 complete seconds. Abigail felt the warmth rise in her throat. She recognized that expression. She'd encountered variations of it since she was 12. That particular look certain women wore when they assessed her physique. As though her size were an inconvenience she'd carelessly neglected to remedy. "I understand," Abigail said. Her voice emerged evenly. She was grateful for that. "Good." Charlotte headed for the door. 4-tier cake. Something the St. Louis visitors haven't witnessed before. Every dish must reflect that same caliber. She halted with one hand on the frame. "And I want absolute assurance that no one in that room has any cause to speculate about the help." She departed without awaiting a reply. Abigail stood in the vacant kitchen, breathing slowly through her nose. Then she secured her apron, consulted her list, and commenced her labor. The initial 2 weeks were grueling, protracted, and largely solitary. Abigail rose before 4 each morning, toiled until daylight faded, and occupied every hour between constructing the feast's framework from scratch. She cured her own hams. She prepared stock. She tested her biscuit formula 5 times before the rise met her standards. She mapped out the wedding cake down to the individual sugar blossoms. She intended to shape by hand. Tiny white roses and trailing sweet peas. Each crafted from nothing, each positioned with deliberation. No one entered the kitchen except to drop off supplies. No one addressed her except to hand over invoices. That suited her. That was the agreement. She had worked alone previously, and would do so again. The labor itself sufficed. It always had. Or she had consistently told herself it did. It was a Thursday morning during the 2nd week, just past 5, when the rear door swung open, and everything about that arrangement quietly transformed. He was tall. Not dramatically, but with the unself-conscious ease of a man who had always been tall and had ceased noticing years ago. Work clothes already dust-streaked at the knees. Boots worn at the heel in the manner boots become, worn through genuine use, not mere appearance. Dark hair touched at the temples with early silver. He possessed a face that had once been handsome and had matured past 30. 5 into something more solid and superior to mere handsomeness. He stopped upon seeing her. "Morning," he said. "Morning." Abigail kept her hands submerged in the dough. "Can I assist you?" "Sir." Just after coffee, he approached the stove, lifted the pot, and poured a cup with the naturalness of a man in his own kitchen, which she reminded herself he was. He settled at the far end of the workspace, wrapping both hands around the mug. "You're the cook." Abigail Carter. Ethan Walker. He met her gaze directly, without pretense or performance. "I won't impede you. I simply take my coffee here most mornings. Quietest room in the house before the day begins. It's your kitchen, Mr. Walker. You don't require my permission." "Maybe not," he said, "but you're running it." Thought that was worth acknowledging. Abigail regarded him for just a moment. Then she returned to her dough. He drank his coffee without interrogating her. He didn't observe her work in the manner that made her uncomfortable. That cataloging gaze. The kind that made her feel evaluated. He merely occupied the early stillness, occasionally glancing out the window. His presence in the kitchen felt, in a way she couldn't fully articulate, like companionship rather than intrusion. He departed after 20 minutes. "Much obliged for the quiet," he said, and walked back out. He returned the following morning, and the one after that. By the third week's end, it had become something neither had named, but both anticipated. Ethan Walker arrived just past 5, poured his coffee, settled at the workspace's far end. Abigail worked. Occasionally, he posed a question. Not about the wedding, not about Charlotte's requirements, but about the work itself. Why the vinegar in the crust? "Keeps the gluten from tightening," she said. "Makes it flake instead of chew." He considered that. And you can taste the difference. You can feel it before you taste it. The way it yields when you press it with a fork. He nodded slowly, as though storing that somewhere useful. Another morning. "How do you know when a bread's done without cutting into it?" "Sound," she said. "Hollow knock on the bottom, it's done. Dense thud, give it 10 more minutes." "Your mother teach you that?" "My mother and my grandmother before her." She smoothed the dough without raising her gaze. "My grandmother came west from Kentucky in a covered wagon. Cooked every meal on the trail." She said the most important thing about feeding people wasn't the recipe. What was it? Intention. Abigail set down the rolling pin. "Whether you thought about the people eating it while you made it," she said, "you could taste the difference between food made in a hurry and food made with care." Ethan was silent for a moment. "I believe that," he said. "Most people think it sounds like nonsense. Most people eat without paying attention." He rotated his cup in a slow arc across the table. "My mother used to say something similar, that a meal could tell you everything about who made it if you were listening properly." A pause. "She's been gone 12 years. "I'm sorry," Abigail said. "She'd have liked you." He stated it plainly, without adornment, and stood, donning his hat. "Good morning, Miss Carter." He left. Abigail stood with her hands still in the flour, gazing at the closed door for an extended moment. She assured herself it signified nothing. He was a rancher with decent manners and a habit of early rising. In 6 weeks, he would be a married man, and she would be back in her farmhouse, counting drips into her tin pail. The chasm between her existence and his was not the kind feelings could traverse. Not matter how naturally a man said, "She'd have liked you," over a 5 o'clock coffee. She told herself all of that. Then the door at the kitchen's far end burst open, and Charlotte Beaumont strode in, clutching a sheet of paper, wearing that particular expression Abigail had already learned to brace for. "The cake design," Charlotte said, extending the paper without approaching, forcing Abigail to come to her. "I've had illustrations sent from St. Louis. You'll use this." Abigail accepted the paper. She studied it. The design was elaborate, architecturally ambitious in a way that had little to do with practical cake construction. Thin-spun, sugar columns, cascading glass like tiers, details requiring equipment Abigail lacked, techniques spanning 6 tiers instead of 4 that would collapse under their own weight within an hour of assembly. "Mum," she said carefully, "this design is beautiful, but the structural demands are your problem to solve." Charlotte said, "That's what you're being paid for. The spun, sugar columns won't support this height in July heat. We'll be outdoors for part of the service and the temperature. Then find a way to manage the temperature." "Charlotte." Abigail stopped. She heard herself speak the name. No title, just the name. And she observed Charlotte's eyes sharpen and freeze. "I'm not pushing back because I can't execute it. I'm warning you what will happen so it doesn't occur at your wedding." If that cake collapses before 200 guests, that's not something I can remedy at the table." The ensuing silence carried weight. Charlotte advanced one step, her voice dropping. "You will not address me by my given name," she said. "And you will not dictate what is or isn't feasible. Do you comprehend your position in this household?" Abigail held her gaze. "I'm the woman who's going to ensure your wedding feast is the finest thing anyone in this territory has ever tasted," she said. "That's what I am." Charlotte stared at her. "I'll adapt the design," Abigail continued, reining her voice back to level. "I'll deliver something superior to this, and I'll guarantee it holds. You have my word on that." For a moment, nothing stirred. Then Charlotte reclaimed the illustration from Abigail's hand. Not roughly, but with a deliberateness that communicated everything, and departed. Abigail exhaled slowly. Behind her, from the doorway leading to the rear porch, a quiet voice remarked, "That was well handled." She turned. Ethan Walker stood just inside the frame, hat in hand, clearly present for at least the latter portion of the exchange. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked. "Long enough." He stepped inside. His jaw was set in a way she hadn't previously observed. Tight, controlled, the look of a man restraining something that wanted to emerge more forcefully. "She had no right to address you that way." "It's fine, Mr. Walker." "It isn't. Maybe not," Abigail said. "But it's manageable, and I needed to keep it manageable. So I'd ask you not to speak to her on my account." He regarded her for a prolonged moment, visibly processing the impulse to intervene versus the understanding that intervention would cost her more than anyone else. "All right," he said finally. "But I want you to hear something." He advanced one step nearer, his voice low and steady. "I don't know what she said to you your first morning. I don't know what arrangement she imposed. But I want you to know that this kitchen and everything emerging from it belongs to you. And you are not invisible in this house. Not to me." Abigail couldn't respond for a moment. "You hear me?" he said. "I hear you," she said quietly. He nodded once, replaced his hat, walked to the rear door, and paused with his hand on the frame. "The cake you're building," he said without turning. "I saw your sketches on the workspace last week. The one with the sweet peas and climbing roses. A beat. Don't change it. That one's perfect the way it is." He walked out. The door swung shut behind him. Abigail stood alone in the kitchen in the long gold light of a Wyoming afternoon, both palms flat on the work surface, and understood with the slow, certain weight of something she could no longer rationalize away that she was in considerable trouble. Not because of the cake, not because of Charlotte, because Ethan Walker had examined her sketches on a workspace and recalled which one was hers, and said, "That one's perfect the way it is," and walked away without waiting to see the effect it had on her. And it had affected her. Something she had no name for, no safe place to contain. Outside, evening swept in rapidly over the Wyoming hills. Somewhere in the main house, Charlotte Beaumont planned her wedding. Somewhere on the property, Ethan Walker returned to the life he'd already constructed and the choices he'd already made. And Abigail Carter pressed her hands into the flour and steadied herself and began again. The way she always had. The way she was beginning to dread she couldn't sustain forever. The nights were the hardest part, not the work. The work Abigail could manage, had always managed, because work possessed a logic, a sequence of cause and effect that left no room for the kind of thinking that crept in when her hands went still. But the nights, when the kitchen finally fell silent and the ranch settled into darkness, and she lay on the narrow cot she'd been given, in the back room off the pantry, the thinking arrived whether she invited it or not. She thought about Ethan Walker saying, "That one's perfect the way it is," She thought about how he had looked at her. Not through her, not past her. Not at the parts other men cataloged with appetite or dismissal, but at her face, at whatever he found there that seemed worth seeing. She pressed her face into the pillow and instructed herself firmly to stop. She was a widow with a leaking roof and a mortgage and flour under her fingernails. He was a rancher with 2,000 acres and a fiancée from St. Louis and a wedding 6 weeks away. There was no universe in which what she was beginning to feel was anything other than a problem she needed to solve before it solved her. She told herself that every night. Every morning she woke up and it remained. The 4th week arrived with a heat that settled over the ranch like a held breath. Abigail moved faster now. The feast was taking tangible shape, and the rhythm of preparation had become almost physical. A momentum she didn't want to break. She smoked the hams in the early morning hours, when the air was still cool enough to manage the fire properly. She stored her fruit preserves in long rows along the cold cellar shelves. She made her stocks and reduced them and remade them, because the first batch wasn't right, and she didn't do things that weren't right. It was on a morning in that 4th week that she overheard them arguing. She wasn't meant to. The voices filtered through the thin wall, separating the kitchen from the narrow corridor, running alongside it toward the house's front. They weren't shouting. It was worse than shouting, actually. The low, controlled kind of argument where both parties are working very hard to prevent something from breaking open completely. Charlotte's voice first. You spend more time in that kitchen than you do in this house. I have coffee in the morning. I've done it for 10 years. You have coffee with her. A pause. She's working. I sit at the end of the table. We've talked about recipes. Ethan. Charlotte's voice dropped in a way that carried very clearly through the wall. I am not a fool. I know you're not. Then stop treating me like one. I see the way you look at her. Another pause. Longer. Abigail had ceased moving entirely, her hands braced on the workspace, not breathing. Charlotte. She is the hired help. Charlotte said she is a fat widow from a failing farm, and she is here to cook the food and disappear. That is all she is. If you cannot remember that, then I will remind you every single morning until this wedding is done. Silence. Then Ethan's voice, flat and very quiet. Don't say that again. Excuse me? You heard me. His voice didn't rise. That was almost the frightening part, how still it remained. Don't speak about her that way again. The sound of footsteps moving away. Then a door closing with a controlled click that was somehow louder than a slam. Abigail stood in the kitchen and didn't move for a very long time. She had heard every word. She understood with a clarity more painful than she'd anticipated exactly what it meant and what it didn't. Ethan Walker defending her in an empty corridor wasn't a declaration. It was a decent man refusing to allow an indecent thing to be spoken. Nothing more. She couldn't afford to make it more. She picked up her spoon. She returned to work. But her hands weren't quite steady, and she knew it. And she hated knowing it. He came to the kitchen the next morning, the same as always, poured his coffee, sat at the table's end. For a moment, neither spoke, and the silence between them was different from the usual kind of fuller, like a room where someone had recently rearranged the furniture, and neither wanted to be first to acknowledge it. You heard us yesterday, he said. It wasn't a question. Abigail didn't look up from her work.
I wasn't trying to. I know that.
He turned his cup in a slow circle. I'm sorry you had to. You don't owe me an apology for something. Maybe not. A pause. I owe you one for not saying something sooner. That made her look up. He was watching her with that direct, unguarded expression she'd come to recognize, the one with no performance, no management, just whatever was actually there. "Mr. Walker," she said carefully, "I need this job. I know. I need it to stay simple." He held her gaze. Something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or a decision. "All right," he said quietly. Simple. He drank his coffee. She worked her dough. But the silence between them had shifted again, and they both knew it, and neither mentioned it. The argument, it turned out, had not improved Charlotte's temperament. She appeared in the kitchen that same afternoon with her mother, a thin, sharp, featured woman named Eleanor Beaumont, who wore her disapproval like a garment custom fitted for the occasion. Eleanor traversed the kitchen, the way a building inspector examines a property, not seeking what was present, but what could be cited. "The cake," Eleanor said, stopping before Abigail's workspace, where the base tier was being assembled. "This isn't the design Charlotte approved. I adapted the design for structural stability." Abigail said, "The original wouldn't survive July heat. What I've built will." Charlotte approved a design. Charlotte approved a concept. What I've built is that concept made workable. Eleanor turned to regard her with an expression, suggesting she was unaccustomed to being answered. "You adapted our instructions without permission." "I adapted your instructions to prevent your daughter's wedding cake from collapsing in front of 200 guests. Abigail set down her spatula and looked at Eleanor directly. "With respect, Mrs. Beaumont, that is exactly what you're paying me to do." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Charlotte said from the doorway, "Let it go, Mother. She's right about the heat." Both Abigail and Eleanor looked at Charlotte simultaneously. It was clearly not the response either had anticipated. Charlotte met Abigail's eyes for just a moment, not warmly, not with any softness, but with a flatness that was almost honest. Then she looked away. "Just make sure it's impressive," she said, and walked out. Eleanor followed with one final look at Abigail that promised the matter wasn't closed. Abigail released a slow breath. She picked up her spatula. 2 days later, the ranch received visitors. 3 men arrived in the early afternoon. Business associates of Charlotte's father, come to discuss terms of a land acquisition, apparently tied in some way to the Walker property. Abigail knew this only because the ranch housekeeper, a quiet woman named May, who had worked the property for 15 years, stopped by the kitchen that evening and sat at the table, with the expression of someone who needed to speak something aloud to another person before it consumed her. "They want the eastern grazing acres," May said, wrapping her hands around a cup of Abigail's coffee. "Beaumont's men. They've been after them for 2 years. The railroad wants to run a line through, and those acres are the only direct path. That's Ethan's best grazing land," Abigail said. May looked at her. "Yes, it is." Abigail went still. "As the wedding?" "I don't know what the wedding is," May said. "I know what I've seen and heard in 15 years on this property. I know Ethan Walker is not a man who sells what he's built. And I know those men didn't come here to congratulate him on his engagement." After May left, Abigail stood alone in the kitchen and let that settle. She thought about Ethan, about the particular way he spoke of his land. The same way she spoke of her 40 acres. The way a person talks about something that isn't just property, but proof. Proof that they had held on. Proof that something they had built had survived. She thought about Charlotte's father and the railroad and 200 wedding guests, who were also apparently an audience for a business arrangement. She thought about a man who came to his own kitchen every morning before dawn and talked about food and grief and intention, and his mother who had been gone 12 years. She thought about how little she actually knew and how much she felt like she did. She was still thinking about it the next morning, when Ethan came in. poured his coffee, and sat down. She could see immediately that something was different. His jaw was set. His movements were quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that wasn't peace, but compression. She let him sit for a moment. Then she said, without looking up from her work, "You don't have to tell me anything." "I know," he said. "But if you need to say it out loud to someone, I'm here." A long pause. Long enough that she thought he wouldn't take it. Then, "My father built this ranch on those eastern acres. The grass there is different. Comes up thicker, holds water longer in dry summer. The cattle do better on it than anywhere else on the property." He paused. "Beaumont's people want me to sell it as part of the marriage arrangement. Call it a wedding gift to the railroad expansion. Dress it up in all kinds of language, but that's what it is." Abigail set down her rolling pin. "What does Charlotte say?" "Charlotte says it's a reasonable thing." Another pause. "She says land is just land." The silence between them was very full. "Is it?" Abigail asked quietly. Ethan looked at her. "No," he said. "It isn't." "Then you know what you need to do." Knowing and doing aren't the same thing when you're 3 weeks from a wedding and 200 people have already been invited. "No," she agreed. "They're not the same thing at all." He looked at his hands around the coffee cup. "My father used to say that the worst decisions a man makes are the ones he makes to avoid disappointing other people. He said those were the decisions you carried longest. Your father was right. He usually was." He looked up at her. Something in his face had loosened slightly, not resolved, but relieved. The way a person looks after speaking a true thing aloud that they've been holding quietly for too long. "Thank you," he said. "I didn't do anything. You listened." He stood up. "You'd be surprised how rare that is." He left. Abigail stayed at her workspace, her hands in the flour, and understood that the distance she had been so carefully maintaining had been closed. Not by anything dramatic, not by anything she could point to clearly and say, "There, that was the moment," but by accumulation. By 5 o'clock mornings and questions about pie crust and grief offered plainly across a workspace, and a man who said, "You'd be surprised how rare that is." Like it was simply true. She was in trouble. She had known it for weeks, but knowing hadn't stopped it, and she was beginning to understand that knowing wasn't going to. That same evening, she was carrying the last of the supply crates into the cold cellar, when she heard Charlotte's voice again. Not arguing this time, but performing. The bright social register that Abigail had come to recognize as Charlotte's audience voice. There were 2 other women with her on the back porch, friends visiting for the week, their voices drifting down to where Abigail stood in the cellar doorway with a crate in both arms. "She's very good. I'll admit that," Charlotte was saying. "The food has been exceptional. You must be pleased." Relieved is more accurate. Charlotte's tone was light, amused. "I was worried about hiring locally. You never know what you're going to get. But she stays out of the way. She doesn't require managing, and she understands her place. That's all one can really ask of that sort of woman." "What sort?" the second woman asked. Charlotte laughed. A small, elegant sound. "The kind with more talent than prospects. She's a widow, you know. Struggling farm outside of town. A bit." A pause. "Substantial. You'll understand why I insisted she stay out of sight during the celebration." The women laughed together. Abigail stood in the cellar doorway, with a crate in both arms, and let it pass over her. All of it. The words and the laughter, and the particular casual cruelty of women who had never once wondered whether there was enough food to last the week. She let it pass. She carried the crate inside. She came back up the stairs. She closed the cellar door behind her. And she stood alone in the kitchen in the gathering dark and made herself a promise. Not out of anger, not out of wounded pride, but out of something older and quieter and more certain than either. She was going to make the finest wedding feast this county had ever seen. Not for Charlotte Beaumont, not for the railroad men or the St. Louis guests or the 200 people who would never know her name. She was going to make it because it was hers. Because her hands had built it, and her knowledge had designed it. And her grief, and her grandmother's wisdom, and her mother's cast iron skillet had all gone into every component. She was going to make it perfect. And then she was going to walk out of this kitchen and back to her 40 acres and her leaking roof. And she was never going to think about Ethan Walker's 5 o'clock coffee again. She told herself that very clearly, standing in the dark of her own kitchen, flour on her hands and her jaw set hard. She almost believed it. The morning of July 14th arrived the way the worst days always do, quietly, ordinarily, with no warning in the air to tell you that by nightfall nothing would be the same. Abigail had not slept. She had been in the kitchen since 2 in the morning, moving through final preparations with the focused stillness of someone who had long since pushed past exhaustion into that particular state beyond it, where the body simply continues because the mind has given it no other option. The bread was done. The hams were rested and ready to carve. The pies, 14 of them, set in careful rows along the cold cellar shelves, had been finished the night before. The vegetable dishes were prepped and waiting. The sauces were made. And the cake stood in the center of the workspace, 4 tiers. Ivory buttercream smooth as pressed linen, climbing roses and sweet peas in pale pink and white, each pressed by hand, each petal placed with the kind of attention that had no name except care. It was the finest thing Abigail had ever made. She knew it without vanity. The way a craftsman knows when the work is exactly right, not because it was impressive, but because it was true. She stood before it for one long moment. Then May appeared in the doorway. "Wagons are arriving. You've got maybe an hour before the first guests reach the house." "I'm ready," Abigail said. "Are you?" May looked at her with the particular expression she'd been wearing for the past 2 weeks. Not quite pity, not quite worry, something between the two that Abigail found harder to bear than either. "Don't," Abigail said quietly. "I haven't said anything. You're about to." May pressed her lips together. "Then he asked about you this morning before you were up. Asked if you'd slept. Asked if you needed anything brought in from the supply shed." She paused. "I thought you should know." Abigail said nothing. "I've worked this ranch 15 years, May said. "I know what that man looks like when he's just being polite. And I know what he looks like when he means something. That wasn't polite, May." Abigail picked up her carving knife and tested the edge against her thumb. "I need today to be simple. Simple." May said the word like she was examining it for cracks. "All right." She turned to go, then stopped. "For what it's worth, whatever happens today, you made something extraordinary in this kitchen. Don't let anyone take that from you." She left before Abigail could answer. The first guests began arriving before 10, and by noon, the ranch had transformed into something bearing almost no resemblance to the quiet working property Abigail had spent 6 weeks learning. 200 people moved through the grounds, and the main house in their best clothes. Voices layered over each other, laughter coming in waves. The kitchen was her entire world. The door to the corridor stayed shut. The window above the workspace was her only connection to the sound of what was happening outside it. She worked and she did not think. That was the only way through. At noon, Charlotte came to the kitchen. She was fully dressed ivory silk, perfectly fitted, hair arranged in a way that must have taken her maid 2 hours. She looked like exactly what she was. A beautiful woman about to marry well in front of everyone who mattered to her. She stood in the doorway and looked at the cake, and for a moment, her expression did something Abigail hadn't seen before. Something that was almost honest. "It's beautiful," Charlotte said. Abigail looked at her. "Thank you, ma'am." Charlotte's eyes moved from the cake to Abigail. The honesty, whatever it was, closed back over. "The service begins at 1. I want the first courses on the tables by 2:30. Everything exactly as discussed." "Yes, ma'am." Charlotte started to turn. "Miss Beaumont." The words were out before Abigail had decided to say them. Charlotte stopped. Abigail kept her voice even. "I hope today is everything you want it to be." Charlotte looked at her for a long moment. Something passed behind her eyes. Complex, unreadable, gone before Abigail could name it. "Do your job," Charlotte said. She left. Abigail turned back to her workspace. She had 3 hours. She used every minute. The ceremony happened without her. She heard the music from the kitchen. A fiddle and a guitar. Someone playing well. And she heard the murmur of 200 people settling into attention. And then the quiet that meant something was beginning. She moved through her work with her back to the corridor door and her hands in constant motion. And she did not let herself think about what was happening in that room, or who was standing at the front of it, or what his face looked like when he made a promise he couldn't take back. She didn't think about any of that. She thought about the temperature of the serving dishes and the timing of the carving and the exact order in which the courses needed to move from kitchen to table. She thought about her 40 acres. She thought about the tin bucket under the leak in the back bedroom and how $40 was going to fix the roof. And how that was enough. That had to be enough. By the time the ceremony ended and the celebration moved into the banquet hall, Abigail had the first course ready. May and 2 young ranch hands moved the dishes through the corridor, and she stayed in the kitchen and kept going. Course after course, each one right? Each one exactly what she had planned and tested and built from the ground up over 6 weeks of 5 o'clock mornings and aching hands, and a kind of dedication that had very little to do with the money anymore. If she was honest, the feedback came back in fragments through May's trips between kitchen and hall. A cattle rancher from Laramie said the smoked ham was the finest he'd had in 30 years. A woman from Cheyenne asked 3 times who had made the bread. Charlotte's father held up his wine glass and declared the feast a credit to the Walker name. "Nobody," said Abigail Carter. Nobody was supposed to. She kept working. It was May who brought the cake out, with 2 of the hands helping carry it steady. Abigail stood at the kitchen window and watched the door to the corridor close behind them. She had done everything she could do. She untied her apron. She sat down on the stool by the cold stove for the first time in 12 hours. She was so tired that the edges of the room had gone slightly soft. The way things look when the body has been pushed past what it was reasonably meant to sustain. She closed her eyes for just a moment. She was almost peaceful. And then she heard Charlotte's voice through the wall. Not through the thin corridor wall this time, but through the main wall of the kitchen, which meant Charlotte was speaking at volume in the banquet hall, close enough to carry. The celebration had reached the toasting hour, and Charlotte Beaumont was on her feet, with a glass in her hand, performing the way she did when she had an audience large enough to matter. "I want to take a moment," Charlotte said, her voice carrying that bright, carrying tone of a woman raised to be heard, "to address the extraordinary meal you've all enjoyed this afternoon." Murmurs of approval, glasses lifted. "Many of you have asked who is responsible for this feast, and I want to be honest with you all, because honesty is something I value above almost everything." Abigail opened her eyes. Something in Charlotte's tone had shifted. Still bright, still performed, but with an edge underneath that Abigail recognized the way you recognize the sound of ice cracking beneath your feet. "We hired a local woman to handle the cooking," Charlotte continued. "A widow from outside of town, hardworking in the way that simple women are hardworking. But I want you all to know," a small, elegant laugh, "that what you've eaten today was not simply the result of her efforts. Every dish was planned under my direct supervision. Every decision about the menu, the presentation, the standard we were aiming for, that guidance came from me. She executed. I directed." Another laugh, lighter, without that direction. "I'm afraid what you'd have eaten would have been a great deal more rustic." Laughter moved through the room like a wave. "I say this not to diminish her," Charlotte went on, warming to it now, holding the room the way she'd been trained to hold a room, "but to be transparent with our guests. When you hire a woman of that," a pause, "particular type, you learn quickly to manage expectations. She's stout, she's plain, she's never been anywhere, and her ambitions extend no further than her kitchen." The laughter came again, fuller this time. "Bless her heart." The last 3 words landed in the banquet hall like an amen. Abigail sat on her stool in the kitchen. She did not move. Every dish on every table, every pie on every shelf, every petal of every sugar flower on that 4-tier cake. Every 5 o'clock morning, an aching back, an hour of planning and knowledge passed down from a grandmother who had crossed the country in a wagon and never lost a single person in her care. Bless her heart. Her hands were completely still. She had prepared herself for being invisible. She had prepared herself for not being thanked, and not being credited, and walking out the back way while everyone celebrated in the front room. She had not prepared for being made into a joke. May came through the kitchen door 3 seconds later, and one look at her face told Abigail that May had heard every word. May crossed the room in 4 steps and put both hands on Abigail's shoulders and opened her mouth. "Don't," Abigail said. "Abigail, don't say anything." Her voice was very quiet, very steady. "I'm all right. You are not all right. I will be." She stood up, her legs held. "Good. I'm going to finish clearing the kitchen and then I'm going to go."
"You can't just." "May."
She looked at her directly. "I need to leave. That's what I need. I need to walk out of this kitchen and down the road, and I need to go home." May looked at her for a long moment with those 15-year eyes that saw too much. Then she stepped aside. Abigail untied her apron and laid it on the workspace. She took off the kitchen cloth she wore over her dress. She gathered her knives in their roll of cloth. Her mother's cast iron skillet wrapped back in its straw. Moving with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned a long time ago to leave places without making a scene. She was at the back door when it opened from the outside. Ethan Walker stepped in. He was still in his wedding clothes. Pressed dark coat, white shirt. The silver watch chain at his vest that she had noticed on the first morning. She'd seen him dressed for something other than ranch work. His face was not the face she was used to seeing in the early morning quiet of the kitchen. Something in it had been pushed past its usual composure and not quite recovered. He stopped when he saw her with her things gathered. "You're leaving," he said. "I'm done here," she said. "Congratulations on your—" She had no right. His voice was low and absolutely controlled, the way it had been in the corridor that day. Except this time, there was something underneath the control that hadn't been there before. Something that had been pushed hard enough that it was pushing back. "What she said in there is none of my concern." Abigail kept her voice level. It's your wedding day, Mr. Walker. Please go back to your guests, Abigail. Please. He didn't move. She stood up in front of 200 people, and she took what you built and she... He stopped. He pressed his jaw together. Every person in that room who's ever eaten your food knew it was wrong. I could see it on their faces. It doesn't matter. It does matter. He stepped fully into the kitchen. What you made today was extraordinary. Every person in that hall knows it. And she stood up and laughed about you like you were. Like I was the fat kitchen widow who should have stayed invisible. Abigail looked at him directly. For the first time since he'd walked in, her voice was very quiet. She wasn't entirely wrong, Mr. Walker. That's what I was hired to be. Something crossed his face, raw and fast and immediately controlled. That's not what you are, he said. It doesn't matter what I am. It matters what the arrangement was. And I agreed to it. She tightened her grip on the knife roll. I need to go. She moved toward the door. He said, I'm not going back in there. She stopped. I'm not, he said again, quieter. I can't stand in that room beside that woman. And he stopped. He ran one hand over the back of his neck. The composure he'd been holding cracked just slightly. Just enough to show what was underneath it. I'm sorry. I know that's not your problem. I know you need to go. He looked at her. I needed to say it to someone who'd understand why. The kitchen was very quiet. Abigail stood with her hand on the doorframe and her things held against her chest and looked at Ethan Walker in his wedding clothes with the composure going out of his face and understood with the full terrible clarity of someone who had spent 6 weeks very carefully, not understanding it that she was not the only one in this room who was in trouble. She had thought she was alone in it. She had been wrong. Ethan. She used his name. She hadn't done that before. Not out loud. Not to his face. She saw him register it. Whatever is happening in that room, you need to go back and face it. Not for her, for yourself. She held his gaze. You're not a man who walks away from hard things. I've known that about you since the 3rd morning. He looked at her for a long moment. Go, she said softly. He didn't go. Instead, he said very quietly, what if the hard thing isn't in that room? The silence that followed that question was the loudest thing Abigail had ever heard. She opened the door. She walked out into the July afternoon, her knives in her arms and her jaw set, and her heart doing something she had absolutely no control over whatsoever. Behind her, she heard Ethan Walker take one long breath. And then she heard his footsteps. Not going toward the back road, not going toward the door she had just walked out of, going back toward the banquet hall. She walked faster. She did not look back. But she heard it anyway, carried on the flat Wyoming air from the open windows of the hall. Ethan Walker's voice raised in a room full of 200 people for the first time all day, saying Charlotte's name in a tone that stopped every conversation in the building at once. Abigail stopped walking. She stood on the dusty road at the edge of the Walker property. She stood very still, and she listened. She should have kept walking. She knew that. Every reasonable part of her knew that the correct thing to do was to moving down that road until the Walker Ranch was behind her and her own 40 acres were ahead of her and the whole 6 weeks of it. The mornings and the flour and the 5 o'clock coffee. And the way he said, it was perfect the way it is. Could be folded up and put somewhere she didn't to look at it. She stood on the road and did not move. The sound coming from the banquet hall had changed. The music had stopped. The layered murmur of 200 people in celebration had gone flat and strange, the way a room sounds when something unexpected has entered it and nobody is sure yet what it means. She heard Charlotte's voice, sharp, rising. She heard Ethan's, steady, low, carrying anyway. She could not make out the words from where she stood. She wasn't sure she wanted to. She told herself she wasn't sure she wanted to anyway, which was not exactly the same thing. Then the front door of the ranch house opened, and May came out at something close to a run for a woman of May's age and dignity, which meant it was serious. May saw Abigail standing on the road and changed direction without breaking pace. "You need to come back," May said. "May." He stopped the wedding. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Abigail looked at her. "What do you mean he stopped it?" "I mean he stood up in front of 200 people and told Charlotte he couldn't do it." May grabbed Abigail's arm, not hard, just insistent. He said, "Lord help me, I'm going to quote this exactly because I will never forget it as long as I live." He said, "I will not spend my life beside a woman who measures people's worth by what they weigh and what they own. I watched you do it for 6 weeks, and I told myself it wasn't what I thought it was. I was wrong." May paused for exactly one breath. Then Charlotte threw her wine glass at the wall, and her father started shouting about the land deal, and 3 of the Beaumont cousins stood up, and it went from there. Abigail stared at her. "So," May said, "I need you to come back." "I am not going back into that hall. Not the hall, the kitchen. He's asking for you. He doesn't need me right now. He needs Abigail Carter." May stepped directly in front of her and looked her in the eye with 15 years of watching people make decisions they'd regret. "That man just burned down the biggest social arrangement this county has seen in a decade because he could not stand in a room and pretend that what she did to you was acceptable. The least you can do is not disappear down a road while he's still standing in the wreckage." The silence between them was very brief. Abigail turned around. The ranch was in controlled chaos. Guests had moved from the banquet hall out to the grounds, clustering in the groups that form when something dramatic has happened, and nobody is ready to leave, because leaving means missing whatever happens next. The Beaumont family had gathered at the far end of the porch. Charlotte's father, red-faced and talking loudly at a man Abigail didn't recognize. Charlotte herself nowhere visible. Abigail kept her head down and moved through the kitchen door. Ethan was there. He had taken off his coat. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, which was such an ordinary detail, in such an extraordinary moment, that it almost made her laugh. He was standing at the far end of the workspace. Her workspace. The one she had worked at every morning for 6 weeks, with both hands braced on the surface and his head down. He looked up when she came in. "You came back," he said. "May is persuasive." Abigail set her things down on the side counter. She looked at him carefully. His face was composed, but only just, the composure sitting over something that was still running hot underneath it. "Are you all right?" "No," he said simply, without any attempt to dress it up. "Not particularly." "What happened in there?" He straightened, ran one hand over his jaw. "I walked back into that room, and I stood next to Charlotte, and I looked out at 200 people eating food that you made. And I thought about what she had said about you. And I thought about the Eastern Acres and the railroad men. And I thought about my father saying, 'The worst decisions are the ones you make to avoid disappointing other people.'" He paused. "And I couldn't do it. Ethan." She kept her voice careful. "You just ended your engagement on your wedding day." "I know that. In front of 200 people. I'm aware. Charlotte's father is going to come after that land deal with everything he has." "Probably." He looked at her directly. "I know what I did. I'm not asking you to tell me it was wise. Then what are you asking?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped. "I'm asking if you're all right. What she said about you in that room." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Stop saying you're fine when you're not." The directness of it stopped her cold. She looked at him standing across her workspace, sleeves rolled up, composure barely holding, asking her to tell the truth for once instead of managing it. And she felt something in her chest give way. Not dramatically, not with any kind of relief. Just a slow settling, like a wall that had been leaning for a long time, finally touching the ground. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not fine. I've spent 6 weeks being invisible in a house where the work I did was the best I've ever done in my life." And she stood up in that room and turned me into a punchline for 200 people and called it honesty. She pressed her lips together. "That's not fine. It just is what it is. It shouldn't be what it is. A lot of things shouldn't be what they are." She looked at him. "That doesn't change them." He moved from his end of the table to her end, not quickly. With the deliberate care of someone who was conscious of every inch of the distance. He stopped with the width of the workspace still between them and looked at her with the same directness he had been looking at her with since the first morning, except that now there was nothing on top of it and nothing behind it and nothing managing what it was. "I have been trying," he said, "for 6 weeks to be fair to a situation I had already walked into. I knew something was wrong before you ever arrived here. I knew it in February when her father's men first came about the land, and I started to see what the shape of this thing actually was." He paused. "I stayed in it anyway because I thought." He stopped. "What did you think?" she asked quietly. "I thought wanting to get out of something wasn't a good enough reason to get out of it. I thought obligation was the same thing as integrity." He held her gaze. "I was wrong about that too." Outside, a door slammed somewhere in the main house. Both of them registered it without moving. "She's going to say this was about me," Abigail said. "I know. People will believe her. Some will. Your reputation." "Abigail." He said her name the way he'd said it earlier in the afternoon, not as a stop, but as a request. "Come back to the real thing. I'm not asking you to solve this. I'm not asking you to manage it or make it easier or turn it into a problem you can fix. He exhaled. "I just needed to be somewhere that felt honest for 5 minutes." She looked at him for a long moment. "This kitchen," she said. "Yes. Has always been the warmest room in the house," she said, echoing his own words from the very first morning back at him. Something in his face shifted. "You remembered that?" "I remember everything," she said simply. The kitchen was very quiet. Then the door opened and everything got louder. Charlotte Beaumont came in fast and she came in angry, which was a different Charlotte than the controlled, performing version Abigail had spent 6 weeks learning. This Charlotte had her silk dress slightly disarranged, and her hair beginning to come undone, and her eyes carrying the particular bright fury of someone who has been humiliated in front of everyone they wanted to impress. She looked at Abigail. She looked at Ethan. "Of course," she said. "Of course you're in here, Charlotte," Ethan started. "Don't." She walked fully into the kitchen. "Don't say my name in that tone. Don't stand there in your wedding shirt in the kitchen with the help and tell me I'm wrong about what this is." "You're not wrong about what this is," Ethan said quietly. "You were never wrong about that."
"I was."
Charlotte stopped, whatever she had prepared to say next. Abigail could see it in her face, the speech she'd built on the walk from the banquet hall. It didn't fit anymore. She looked at Ethan for a long moment with an expression that was doing several things at once. And then she looked at Abigail, And what was in her face then was something Abigail hadn't expected. Not fury, not contempt, something that looked underneath all the performance and the damage almost like recognition. "You knew," Charlotte said to Abigail, "didn't you? All along." Abigail didn't pretend to misunderstand. "I suspected," she said carefully. "I didn't think it was my place to say so." "No." Charlotte laughed, short and without any warmth, but also without cruelty. Just a sound that came out. "No, you wouldn't. You're too decent for that, aren't you?" She said it without softness, but also somehow without malice. Like a fact she had arrived at against her preference. She turned back to Ethan. The fury had gone lower, banked down into something colder and more honest. "My father is threatening to involve lawyers over the land agreement. I know. He'll make things difficult. I know that."
"Too. You're not afraid of it."
"I'm not," he said. She studied him for a moment. "You were never going to sell those acres," she said slowly. "Were you? Not even for me." He held her gaze. He didn't answer, which was itself an answer. Charlotte nodded once. A small, precise movement like something being closed. "Well," she said, "at least that's honest." She looked at Abigail one more time. Her voice dropped. And what came out of it was something that cost her. Abigail could tell. The words moving through the performance, and coming out on the other side of it. "What you made today was extraordinary."
"You know that."
Abigail said nothing. "I said things I shouldn't have said." Charlotte continued, clipping each word clean. "In there and elsewhere. That's..." She stopped, started again. "That isn't something I can undo. But I want you to know that I knew, while I was saying it, that it wasn't true." She left before Abigail could respond. The kitchen was quiet again. Abigail stood in the silence of it, and understood that she had just watched Charlotte Beaumont do the hardest thing Charlotte Beaumont had probably ever done, and that it didn't fix anything, and that it also wasn't nothing. "She's not entirely what I thought she was," Abigail said finally. "No," Ethan said. "Neither am I." She looked at him. "I let it go on too long," he said. "I saw how she spoke to you that first morning, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in an arrangement she had made. I had coffee in your kitchen every morning for 6 weeks, and I listened to you and He stopped. "I let you walk into that hall today knowing she might do something like that. You didn't know she'd do that. I knew she was capable of it." His voice was steady, but it had something in it that was working against itself. "That's not a small thing." "No," she agreed.
"It's not. Outside."
The sound of the gathering guests had shifted. Horses being brought around, wagon wheels turning. The first of the departures beginning. The afternoon was moving on without caring about anything that had happened in the kitchen. "What happens now?" Abigail asked. "Not about them. Just in general. What happens now? Her father's people will leave tonight. She'll go with them." He looked at his hands. "The land deal is dead. The Beaumont investment is dead. I'll have a very uncomfortable fall running the operation on what it actually earns instead of what I was about to borrow against." He paused. "I'll manage." "You will," she said. "And you?" he asked. She picked up her knife roll from the side counter. She picked up her mother's skillet. She looked at the workspace that had been hers for 6 weeks and would not be hers again after today. "I'll go home," she said. "I'll fix my roof, Abigail." She looked at him. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and he stood directly in front of her. Close enough that she could see exactly what was in his face, with nothing between them and nothing managing it. "I am not asking you for anything today," he said quietly. "I want to be clear about that. Today is not a day for asking. But I need you to hear something before you walk out." She waited. I did not end that engagement because of what she said about you. Though what she said was wrong, and I will not pretend otherwise. His voice was low and absolutely direct. I ended it because I have spent 6 weeks in this kitchen in the best part of every morning, and I know the difference between what I was walking toward and what I was walking away from. He paused. I needed you to know that. The kitchen was very still. Abigail Carter stood with her mother's skillet in her arms and her knives rolled in cloth against her chest, and looked at Ethan Walker, telling her the truest thing she had ever been told. And she did not cry because she had not cried in 6 years, and she was not going to start in a ranch kitchen with 200 people still on the property. I hear you, she said softly. Good. I still need to go home. I know. She moved to the back door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, the same frame he had stood in so many mornings, hat in hand. The warmest room in the house, she said. She turned back once. The bread, she said. I left a loaf in the second warming drawer. It'll keep 2 days. His mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something quieter and more certain than a smile. Thank you, he said. She walked out into the Wyoming afternoon. She did not look back this time, but she was not walking away the same woman who had arrived on the 1st of May with her knives wrapped in cloth, and her heart wrapped tighter than that, and she knew it. And somewhere underneath all the exhaustion, and the hurt, and the long ache of a day that had broken itself open and rearranged everything inside it, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like the future might belong to her after all. The roof got fixed on a Wednesday. Abigail did it herself. The way she had done everything herself for 6 years. Climbed up before dawn with a hammer and a box of nails and a sheet of new tin she had bought with the last portion of the $40, and worked until the leak was sealed and the bucket in the back bedroom could be put away for good. She came down off the roof with her hands scraped and her back aching and stood in the yard and looked at the sky and felt something that was not quite pride, but was close enough to matter. She had been home for 11 days. 11 days of waking up in her own bed and working her own land and cooking her own food in a kitchen that fit her like a worn-in coat. 11 days of not thinking about the Walker Ranch. 11 days of doing very well at not thinking about the Walker Ranch, if she was being precise about it. Which meant she thought about it constantly, but had developed a reliable system for redirecting her attention before it could settle. The system worked about half the time. The other half she stood at her kitchen window in the early morning and held a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking and thought about 5 o'clock light and a man who asked questions about pie crust and meant them. She put the hammer away. She went inside. She made bread. It was May who came first. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a wagon loaded with provisions. Jars of preserved fruit, a sack of good flour, a smoked pork shoulder wrapped in cloth, and she sat down at Abigail's kitchen table without being asked and looked around the small farmhouse with the expression of someone completing an assessment. He didn't send me, May said before Abigail could ask. I want that clear. I came on my own. All right, Abigail said, putting the kettle on. How are you? Fine, Abigail. She turned around. May was looking at her with those eyes that had seen 15 years of other people's lives and had stopped being patient with evasion somewhere around year 8. I'm managing, Abigail said.
That's honest.
It is. May folded her hands on the table. The county's been talking. I expected that. Most of it is kinder than you'd think. People remember your food. The cattleman from Laramie. Holt. The big one with the gray beard. He told 3 separate people that the smoked ham at the Walker wedding was the finest thing he'd eaten in 30 years, and that whoever made it deserved to have their name known. May paused. He asked me for your name. I gave it to him. Abigail set down the cups. May, you can be annoyed with me later. He's hosting a Cattlemen's Association dinner in September for 60 people, and he wants you to cook it. She slid a folded piece of paper across the table. The number he's offering is on there. Abigail opened it. She looked at the number for a long moment. That's 3 times what the Walker job paid, she said. Yes, it is. She set the paper down carefully. And Charlotte? Gone. Her family left the night of the wedding. The land deal is dead. Beaumont's lawyer sent a letter, but Ethan sent one back, and it appears the matter is settled. May wrapped both hands around her cup. He's been running the ranch same as always. Quiet, working. He had breakfast in the kitchen alone every morning this week. She said this last part without emphasis, which was itself a kind of emphasis. Abigail said nothing. He hasn't asked about you, May said. I want to be accurate. He hasn't asked me anything. He just... She paused, choosing. He's waiting. Not in a way that's putting anything on you. Just in the way that a man waits when he's decided something, and he's giving the other person their time. The kettle began to sound. Abigail poured the water and didn't speak for a moment. Then, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. May. I don't think you're supposed to do anything with it, May said simply. I think you're supposed to decide what you want. Not what's practical, not what's safe, what you actually want. Abigail set the kettle down. She looked out the window at her 40 acres. The scrub grass, the old fence posts, and the sky that went on forever past the far ridge, big and indifferent, and hers. I want to not be afraid, she said quietly. I know, May said. That's the hardest one. May left an hour later. Abigail stood on the porch and watched the wagon go, and then went back inside and sat at her kitchen table, with the piece of paper in front of her, and her mother's skillet hanging on the wall, and the new tin on the roof that wasn't leaking anymore. She sat there for a long time. Then she picked up a pen and wrote 2 letters. One to Mr. Holt in Laramie, accepting the September dinner, and one that she stared at for a full 5 minutes before she finally wrote it, folded it, and addressed it to the Walker Ranch. It said, I believe I left something in your kitchen. I'd like to come by Thursday morning if that's all right. A. Carter. She sent both letters the next morning. Thursday came gray and cool, the first real hint of summer breaking toward fall. Abigail arrived at the Walker Ranch at 5 exactly. Not because she planned it that way, but because that was the hour her feet knew. The kitchen opened. The back door was unlocked. She let herself in. The kitchen was exactly as she'd left it. Same stoves, same hooks, same cold cellar, smell of good earth rising through the floorboards. On the workspace in the center was a coffee cup turned right side up, next to the pot on the stove, still warm, as though someone had just stepped out and would be back shortly. There was also a folded piece of paper beside the cup. She crossed to the table and picked it up. It said, in handwriting that was blunt and direct the same way its owner was blunt and direct, I looked for what you left. I couldn't find it. Maybe you can tell me what it was. E.W. Abigail stood in the kitchen holding the note. She was still holding it when the back door opened, and Ethan Walker came in with his hat in his hand and dust on his boots, and the expression on his face of a man who had been rehearsing something and had just decided to abandon the rehearsal entirely. He stopped when he saw her. Morning, he said. Morning, she said. They looked at each other across the workspace. The same workspace, the same kitchen, the same 5 o'clock light that had started all of this. And the 11 days apart collapsed into nothing because the kitchen felt exactly the same as it always had. Like the truest room in the house. "I got your letter," he said. "I got yours." He looked at the note still in her hand. "I meant it. I went through the whole kitchen. Couldn't find anything you'd left behind." "I know," she said. "So what was it?" She set the note down on the table. "I don't know that it's something you can find by looking," she said carefully. He was quiet for a moment. Then he moved to his end of the table. His end, the far end where he had sat every morning for 6 weeks. And he did not pour coffee. And he did not sit down. He stood with both hands on the table's edge and looked at her the way he had looked at her in this kitchen 100 times, except that now there was nothing else to manage and nothing else in the way. And it was just the looking, clean and unobstructed. "I owe you an honest conversation," he said. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." His voice was steady. "I let you spend 6 weeks in this kitchen under conditions that weren't right, and I told myself I was respecting your independence by not interfering, and the truth is I was avoiding a harder thing." He paused. "I was avoiding admitting to myself what I already knew by the end of the 2nd week." Abigail's hands were very still on the workspace. "I knew the engagement was wrong," he said. "Not just wrong for the reason it ended, wrong from the beginning. Wrong in the way that things are wrong when you've made a decision for practical reasons and called it something else to make it easier to live with." He held her gaze. "And every morning I came into this kitchen and talked to you about pie crust and bread and intention. And my mother, who had been gone 12 years. I knew it more clearly. And I kept coming back anyway, because this was the only hour of the day that felt real." Abigail pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry. She had decided that before she arrived. "Ethan," she said quietly.
What are you asking me?
"I'm not asking you anything yet," he said. "I told you that day. Today is not a day for asking. I meant it then. And the version of it I mean now is." He stopped, chose again. "I'm telling you where I stand so you have accurate information. So whatever you decide it knowing the truth and not a managed version of it." "And where do you stand?" He looked at her directly. "I stand in a kitchen at 5 in the morning, waiting to hear whether a woman I respect more than anyone I've met in 10 years has any interest in letting me learn the rest of what she knows." The kitchen was very quiet. Abigail looked at Ethan Walker across her workspace and understood that she had arrived at the moment she had been managing herself away from for 11 days and 6 weeks before. That there was no more road between her and it. "I'm afraid," she said. The words came out plain without apology. "I know," he said. "So am I. I'm not." She stopped, started again. "I am not a woman people choose, Ethan. I have spent my whole life being the woman who feeds everyone and is thanked by no one and is told she should be grateful for whatever small portion is left over after everyone else has taken what they want." Her voice was very steady. She was proud of that. "I do not know how to trust that this is real." He came around the table. He stopped 2 feet in front of her. Close enough that she had to look up slightly. Close enough that she could see clearly that what was in his face had nothing managed about it, and nothing performed, and nothing that was working toward a particular outcome. It was just there, all of it. "It's real," he said quietly. "I can't prove that in a kitchen on a Thursday morning. I know that, but I'm telling you it is. And I have not in as long as I can remember told a person something was true when it wasn't." She looked at him for a long moment. "I accepted a job," she said finally. "In September. Cattleman's dinner in Laramie. 60 people. Something in his face shifted, surprise, and then something warmer than surprise. "Holt," he said. "You know him?" Good mare. He paused. He'll tell everyone in the territory. That's what May said. She's right. He looked at her with something that was quiet and certain and had no agenda underneath it. That's how it starts. One dinner, then two, then a reputation that travels ahead of you into every room before you walk in. He paused. You've always been good enough for that. You just needed someone to stop keeping you behind a closed door. Abigail looked at him. She thought about 6 years of tin buckets and managing and being adequate and being invisible and being the woman left behind when everything else moved forward. She thought about a grandmother who crossed the country in a wagon and never lost a single person in her care. She thought about intention, about the difference between food made in a hurry and food made with attention. And she understood, standing in this kitchen at 5 in the morning with her hands no longer quite steady, that the same principle applied to everything else worth building. I'm not easy, she said. I want to be clear about that. I am opinionated and I am particular about my work and I have strong feelings about bread and I don't manage well when people speak to me like I'm furniture. I know, he said, and the edge of his mouth moved. I'm serious. So am I? The movement became something real. Not quite a smile, too quiet for that, but certain. I sat at the end of your workspace for 6 weeks, Abigail. I know exactly who you are. He paused. That's why I'm standing here. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she said, the coffee is still warm. He understood immediately. It is. Sit down, she said. I'll tell you how the Laramie dinner should be structured. He sat at his end of the table. She poured the coffee and brought both cups over and sat at her end of the table. Not across from him, but at the same end. The way they had never actually sat, but the way the kitchen had always felt like they could. And she told him about the menu she was already building in her mind for 60 cattlemen in September. And he listened the way he had always listened, with his whole attention, and his hands around the cup, and his eyes on her face. And the kitchen was warm. And the morning came on slowly outside the window, and neither of them said anything for a while about what had just happened between them. Because some things, when they are finally real, don't need to be said out loud to be understood. It was 3 weeks later that he asked her properly, not in the kitchen, but on the porch of her farmhouse at the end of an evening, where he had come to help hang the gate on the south fence and stayed for supper, and then stayed longer than supper. The way people stay when leaving doesn't make sense anymore. He asked plainly and without ceremony, because he was a plain man without ceremony, and she would not have trusted it any other way. She said yes the same way, plainly, without ceremony, looking at him directly in the fading evening light, with the Wyoming sky going gold and enormous behind him. They were married in October, not at the Walker Ranch, not with 200 guests and railroad men and social ambitions dressed up as celebration. In the yard of Abigail's farmhouse on a Saturday morning, with May and a handful of neighbors and the minister from town and the south fence gate that hung straight and true on its new hinges. Abigail wore her best dress, the Sunday one, the blue one, the only good thing in her wardrobe that wasn't saved for her funeral. And underneath it, tied at her waist where no one could see it, her mother's apron. The one her grandmother had sewn and her mother had worn, and she had learned to cook in, before she was tall enough to reach the stove without a stool. Not because she was still the kitchen widow, not because cooking was all she was, because it was where she had come from, and she was not ashamed of where she had come from. And the woman standing in that yard was every version of herself at once. The girl learning at her grandmother's elbow, the young wife feeding a cattle crew, The widow with the leaking roof, and the mortgage, and the cast iron skillet, and the woman who had walked into a stranger's kitchen and been seen finally by someone worth being seen by. Ethan took her hand at the front of the yard. He looked at her the way he had looked at her since the third morning. Like she was worth looking at. Like nothing about looking at her required any adjustment or apology. The minister spoke. Abigail said her vows in a clear, steady voice that carried across the yard and out over the 40 acres she had held on to, and the sky that went on past the ridge and into the enormous western distance. When it was done, May was crying and doing absolutely nothing to conceal it, and the neighbors were clapping. And Ethan Walker held his wife's hand in both of his and said very quietly, so that only she could hear it, "She'd have liked you very much." He meant his mother. Abigail knew that. She looked at the man who had come to her kitchen every morning for 6 weeks and asked questions about pie crust, because they were real questions, and listened because he was a man who actually listened. And she understood fully, cleanly, without any fear left in it, that this was what it felt like when something was true all the way through. Not the prettiest arrangement. Not the most impressive ceremony. Not 200 guests or railroad money or a cake with spun sugar columns built to collapse in the July heat. Just a man and a woman in a yard in October and 40 acres that were hers, and a future that had decided after everything to belong to her after all. And Abigail Carter, who had spent 6 years being invisible, and 6 weeks being hidden, and 1 afternoon being made into a joke in front of everyone, stood in the warm October light and was at last completely and irrevocably seen.